Guys, today you've been learning about Sam Houston, so now we're going to read aloud more about him. A war hero. Sam Houston watched soldiers parade up and down the street. It was March 1813 and the United States was at war with England. Sam was 20 years old and looking for work. He liked the bright uniforms the soldiers wore, so he joined the army. When Sam told his mother that he had enlisted, she gave him a musket and silver ring. Engraved inside the ring was the word honor. "My doors open to brave men, but my doors closed to cowards," she told him. Sam remembered his mother's words. He became a dedicated soldier and a strong leader. In February 1814, Sam met General Andrew Jackson. They became good friends. Cherokee Indians helped Jackson's army attack the Creek Indians. The Creeks had joined the war on Britain's side. Sam's unit charged the Creeks' small fort at Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. An arrow pierced Sam's leg. He fell to the ground in pain. Soldiers ran around him and into the fort. Sam tried to remove the arrow but couldn't. Another soldier stopped to help, but he couldn't pull the arrow out either. "Pull it out or I'll knock you to the ground," yelled Sam over the gunfire and shouting. The soldier tried again, and the sharp, barbed arrow tore loose in a gush of blood. A doctor dressed the wound. General Jackson ordered Sam to rest. Instead, Sam grabbed his musket and led another charge. The Creeks shot him again, twice in the right shoulder. Sam's men dragged him out of the fort. The doctor offered Sam no hope, but Sam refused to die. 2 months later, he returned home. His mother opened her door wide for him. He had fought bravely. Under his mother's tender care, Sam recovered. Young Sam Houston watched the covered wagons roll past his home in Virginia. Many Virginians were moving to Tennessee. He wondered about the traveling families. Often he daydreamed about leading his own covered wagon down the trail. Families had been rolling past his Virginia house almost every day since he was born on March 2nd, 1793. It seemed everyone wanted to live in Tennessee. Even Sam's father, Major Samuel Houston, wanted to live there. But the major died before he got the chance. After his father's funeral in 1807, Sam's daydream and his father's wish came true. Sam helped lead his family's wagon down the great warrior and trading path. The Houstons traveled 300 miles from their home near Lexington, Virginia, to Maryville, Tennessee. Their new home was just 5 miles north of Cherokee land. Sam worked to make the new farm a success. Unlike his brothers, Sam hated farming. No one was surprised when one day he just disappeared. His older brothers found him living with the Cherokee. Life with the Indians was fun for Sam, so he stayed with them. Ulutekia, the tribe's chief, was like a father to Sam. The chief adopted him and called him Kalana, which means the raven in Cherokee. Sam dressed in bright clothes and wore a large cloth around his head like the Cherokee men. He respected and loved his new Indian father. The Cherokee taught Sam how to dance and how to play ball. He also learned how to carve wood or whittle. Mostly, Sam loved to read, and his Indian family let him read in peace. For 3 years, Sam lived with the Cherokee. Then he became a teacher. He wore his bright Indian clothes and headdress to school. He was a good teacher, and his students liked him. During the War of 1812, Sam joined the army. He fought bravely and made his mother proud. The rest of his life, Sam suffered from the war wounds he received at Horseshoe Bend. After the War of 1812, the Cherokee chiefs signed a treaty with the U.S. government agents. The chiefs agreed to move their people farther west to Arkansas. The agents promised them new land. Also, the government would provide food and houses for the Cherokee in Arkansas. Some Cherokee refused to go. General Jackson asked Houston to visit his Indian family. He hoped Houston could talk the Cherokee into moving. The Cherokee wondered whether Houston was their old friend or their new enemy. They didn't wonder for long. Houston was mad when he learned the government agents had not kept their promises. He traveled to Washington, D.C. to complain about the broken treaty. While in the capital, Houston wore his bright Indian clothes and headdress. He wanted to show that he represented his Cherokee friends. Houston finally convinced the Cherokee to move west. They trusted him and believed he would force the government to keep its promises. He was sad to see his friends go. He believed they would be safe and happy in Arkansas. Houston thought that if he were a member of the government, he could make laws that protected the Cherokee. He ran for Congress and was elected in 1823. A few years later, he was elected governor of Tennessee as well. The people of Tennessee thought a lot of Sam until tragedy struck. In April 1829, Sam's young wife Eliza left him. They had been married for only a few months. Houston's enemies said that he must have been a bad husband. The breakup caused a terrible scandal. Houston quit his job as governor. For a long time, Houston was sad and lonely. He visited Ulutukia in Arkansas. Spending time with his Cherokee family helped. The Cherokee Nation adopted him as a brother. In 1830, Houston traveled to Washington, D.C. to visit his old friend Andrew Jackson. Jackson was now the President of the United States. Houston complained about the government agents who had cheated the Cherokee. President Jackson listened to Houston. He didn't like what his friend told him. He fired some of the dishonest agents. During that visit, President Jackson talked to Houston about the Texas Territory. He hoped that someday Texas would become a state. He needed Houston's help to make that dream come true. Houston said he would go to Texas to help. Sam Houston arrived in Texas in December 1832. At that time, Texas belonged to Mexico. While traveling through the territory, Houston met with Jim Bowie, a friend from the War of 1812. Bowie owned a lot of land in Texas. Houston also met Stephen F. Austin, who had established the first American colony in Texas, and William B. Travis, a lawyer from the colonists. Houston learned from these men that most Texians wanted Texas to be an independent country. Houston and a few other Texians met to write a constitution for a free Texas. That made the Mexican government mad. Texas belonged to Mexico. Austin, who had carried the Constitution to Mexico, was put in jail until September 1st, 1835. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, Mexico's president, sent several thousand soldiers to Texas. About 188 men, including Bowie and Austin, fought the Mexican soldiers at the Alamo. Texians asked Houston to bring help to the men at the small fort. Before help could arrive, the Mexican army had killed everyone inside. The Texians insisted that Houston attack Santa Anna's army. Houston decided to trick Santa Anna instead. There were more Mexican soldiers than Texian soldiers. Houston would have to be smarter than Santa Anna to win Texas. On April 21st, 1836, 3,500 Mexican soldiers camped near the Okay, sorry, we cut out. On April 21st, 1836, 2,500 Mexican soldiers camped near the San Jacinto River. Since it was a hot afternoon, they rested. They took a siesta. While they slept, Houston's 743 men crept up to the camp. "Remember the Alamo," Houston cried as they ran toward the sleeping soldiers. The Mexicans were surprised. Many deserted in the confusion. The battle lasted only 18 minutes. Because of Houston's plan, fewer than 10 Texians died that day. In the fight, a bullet broke Houston's ankle. The Mexicans suffered many losses. The Texians killed, wounded, or captured 1,500 Mexican soldiers. The Texians caught Santa Anna before he could escape to Mexico. He surrendered Texas to Sam Houston and the Texians. Grateful Texians elected Houston the first president of the Republic of Texas. Houston spent the next 2 years helping Texas get a strong start as a republic. He worked hard as president, and Texians respected him. Still, Houston hoped that Texas would join the United States someday. After Houston left the presidency in 1838, he traveled. In Alabama, he fell in love with Margaret Moffett Leah. She was just 20 and Sam was 47. People thought he was too old for her. Margaret disagreed, and she married Sam on May 9, 1840. Houston saw his wish come true when Texas became a state in 1846. Texans remembered Sam and sent him to Washington, D.C. as a senator. He missed Margaret and his children. When he wasn't working, he sat on the porch and whittled toys. He listened to his friends argue about slavery. People in the North wanted to abolish it. Many in the South wanted to keep their slaves. Houston knew that many Texans owned slaves. Some even wanted to secede from the Union. Houston wanted Texas to remain a state. Houston was the governor of Texas in 1861 when Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States. The United States was facing a civil war. Southern slave owners did not trust Lincoln. Angry Texans voted to secede and fight Lincoln. Houston wanted Texas to remain in the Union, so he resigned as governor of Texas. The war began on April 12th. 2 years later, the North and South were still fighting. Houston couldn't fight in the war. He was too old and sick. On July 26, 1863, Margaret sat by Sam's bed and held his hand while he slept. For just a moment, he woke up. Texas, Texas, Margaret, said Houston weakly, and then he died. Sam Houston loved the United States, and he loved Texas. He is the only man to serve as a member of Congress and governor in one state, Tennessee, as a senator and governor in another state, Texas, and as president of an independent republic, Texas. He led a dangerous and exciting but honorable life.